A warm welcome back to the channel. My name is Tom and you're watching youtube.com/getnuanced, and in this particular video for you all today, I am going to be reading an excerpt from a book which is called Imagined Communities: Constructing Collective Identities in Medieval Europe, which was published in 2018 by multiple authors: Joanna Alexandra Sobiesk, Michael Tomczyk, Przemysław Tiska, and maybe I butchered those names. They're definitely not from the language that I speak, which is English, or American English, I guess, to be precise. But hopefully you'll find this passage interesting. I will link in the description below a place where you could see what I am referencing and the book itself, and I definitely recommend, as it is an amalgamation of genealogical fictions and chronicle writings in Central Eastern Europe from the 11th to 13th centuries, and is an excellent scholarly resource if you're interested in better understanding the Middle Ages. And in my particular case, I have a particular interest in Byzantine Studies, and that is obviously the intellectual field or education subject which covers the culture and history of the Eastern Roman Empire, which was the continuation of the Roman Empire from the late antiquity to the late end of the Middle Ages, which was from 330 AD to 1453, which is the lifespan of the empire, with an exception of obviously the period between 1204 and 1261, when there was a brief interregnum with the splinter states of the Latin Empire, which was formed from the Fourth Crusade, which was a event which I'll talk about in another video. But when it comes to the events afterwards, the splinter states of the Latin Empire and the Byzantine splinter states of Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond, they would all obviously have a period of fighting over whom would be the one to restore the official imperial rule. And in 1261, the Empire of Nicaea under Michael VIII Palaiologos did so, and then his dynasty, the Palaiologos dynasty, would be the final dynasty to rule over the remnants of the final political vestiges of the Roman Empire, which Augustus himself had started through the early Principate in 27 BC, which obviously the East and West split, and at the end of the 4th century, the empire would then permanently not be governed by a single emperor, but by two separate emperors, the sons of Theodosius the Great, and his sons Honorius in the west and Arcadius in the east would separately, until each of the eastern and western courts themselves would be abolished, would reign over what would be left of the Roman Empire. But obviously there was this transition between classical and medieval, and when that happened, the Roman Empire had itself suffered a lot of territorial losses, especially during the Slavic migrations and the I'd say Arab conquest of the 6th and 7th of the 7th century, and obviously the war with the Sassanids and the Sassanid Persians prior had weakened the empire itself, and that was one which they barely were able to make it out of. And there was many periods which it seemed like the empire was going to end, but by this period, which I'm going to be covering, the end of the Roman Empire was all but inevitable at that point for most contemporary observers, probably even most of the rulers from Constantinople, which could claim in theory to have inherited the office and prestige of Augustus and Constantine, but in reality at the point of Manuel II Palaeologus, who was a distant descendant of Michael VIII in the 14th century, he would desperately try, and 15th century, the 14th and the 13th centuries respectively, the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th. It's the middle, the early middle of the 14th, I guess centuries, period of 1300 to 1400, just in case you weren't aware of that time in particular. He would try his best and would succeed to maintain the fragmented parts of the empire, which at that point, due to the inroads made by the rising Ottoman Beylik that started off as one of many Turkish Beyliks in Anatolia, modern day Anatolia, which is at the time was known as Little Asia or Asia Minor to the Greeks, And ever since Manzikert, there were Turkish migrations from the Seljuks onwards to these individual different beyliks, one of which was the Osman beylik, founded by Osman I, whom would be the founder and namesake of what we refer to in English as the Ottoman Empire, which only fell in the 20th century. And my grandmother, actually, I think I said this in another video, actually was born in 1919 when the Ottoman Empire was still in its final days, which in 1923 it would be formally abolished when the Turkish Republic under Ataturk obviously started what today is still the modern Republic of Turkey, which is now ruled by Erdogan, which I'll talk about in another video, but just goes to show how history itself, there's a lot of context when understanding what countries and their cultures and how we are ourselves as the United States, I think, needs to, when it crafts its foreign policy, be able to have a nuanced understanding of these different variables when it comes to negotiating in a diplomatic sense with varying parties and ensuring that we're able to do so in a way where we're not coming off as ignorant or unable to understand the complexities that perhaps, by our own dispositions from being outsiders, we might not necessarily 100% at first glance be able to 100% grasp. And we can learn from our mistakes, but I think we've never obviously, especially now more than ever, have hit our mark. And I think our foreign policy needs a lot of work. But I think this period of history is very interesting when it comes to developing and seeing a lot of the parallels and being able to learn the lessons of those who came before us. And in this particular passage, which covers the tour that Manuel II Palaeologus had made, as in the end, at the beginning of the 1400s, his capital of Constantinople, which at the point of this time, the Roman Empire, or the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, was basically just a city-state with Constantinople at the Bosphorus, and then there was with an exclave of Mistras, and I think they still held it on to Thessalonica at this time, which was the second city of the empire. And at that point, or the Eastern Roman Empire, at that point there was some fragmenting territories, but they were pretty much essentially already booted out of Asia completely at this point, where I think in the at the end of the 1300s, the final Roman settlement in Asia Minor, Philadelphia, had fallen, and Manuel II himself, along with I think his father, were forced to come as vassals to besiege this city that essentially was in name under Byzantine suzerainty, but in reality was an independent autonomous area which was surrounded by Turkish tribes and completely disconnected by land from the capital. So its governor pretty much acted with, I guess, civil and military authority, as when he did, obviously that was a short period, but the Ottomans conquered there and had completely thrown the Romans out of Asia. And ever since, they were able to, through the civil wars prior to Manuel's, other kinsmen whom prior to him had fought over the control of the empire, even when it benefited the enemies more than it would for themselves to bicker rather than to work together and not fight over who would be in charge. In reality, there was not that much to be in charge of, especially when they kept fighting, they kept losing territory. And at that point, the Ottomans at one point were able to gain a territorial concession when they were strictly in Asia at one point during a civil war from a Byzantine rebel who gave them the access to crossing into Europe and claiming the settlement of Gallipoli, which was a beachhead that they were able to use to make their way into Eastern Europe, completely then conquer most of the territory that the Byzantines had, and even further onwards into where the Serbians, Romanians, and like Bulgarians, I guess in lack of a better term, these different groups that were already all trying to create their own territories and fight, they were all conquered as well by the Ottomans, whom up until the 1600s, 1700s was the undisputed superpower of Europe. And at this point, the Roman Empire was essentially a vassal state that was attempting to maintain its independence, but was really facing the tides of history and time, and it was running out. But Manuel II himself was actually a very talented statesman, and from what all accounts I've read at least, seemed to be extremely charismatic and desperately attempting, despite all odds, to try to save what was left of the empire that he inherited, and was obviously a source of pride and honor for his family that as the last dynasty to rule over this empire that had stretched back into classical times and antiquity, obviously, with Julius Caesar and Augustus. And obviously, there were great men in between, but I think he was very conscious of his heritage as much as his sons, John the Eighth and Constantine the 11th, the last Roman emperor, would be. And obviously, John the Eighth was the penultimate, but his son, Constantine, his brother Constantine, actually, who was one of Manuel's 10 sons or daughters. I think he had a bunch of kids, actually. Back then, it was more normal to have a lot more kids. But yes, his family would actually, at this point, as I've just said, pretty much be at the end of the road. And by the end of Manuel II's life, actually, it was very clear that the days of the empire were numbered, especially since he lived in his last days to see his son actually mess up with backing the wrong faction during an Ottoman civil war, and the faction that they supported ended up losing, and obviously there was retribution from the winning side, whom saw that the Byzantines were meddling too much as they attempted to diplomatically figure out a way to preserve themselves. It backfired epically, and it seemed like, again now with the Ottomans, that the days of the Roman Empire would be ended, and they would in 1453. But this period right now that I'm going to talk about would be the one in which he actually had an opportunity, and from the advice of advisors, would, during the initial siege in which Bayezid I actually would be besieging Constantinople and attempting to conquer it. One of the many times the Ottomans, prior to conquering it, had attempted to prior, which never worked until 1453. Manuel II himself actually left the city in charge with his cousin, whom I think he had a civil war with himself, or nephew actually, John. And surprisingly, his nephew actually, despite getting tempting offers from the Ottoman Sultan, he actually rejected that and continued to defend the city and supervise it in the absence of Manuel. And then Manuel himself visited Western Europe, and this would be the last time that a Roman emperor, or any sort of emperor that could legitimately claim to be a political heir of the Roman Empire. I don't really count the Holy Roman Empire, as Voltaire famously had said, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. In my belief, I believe that's the same thing, in the sense that it was the Germans' way of gaining and conceptualizing its political identity or political legitimacy and identity, I guess, prior to the unification under Bismarck in the 19th century, where they have this modern identity that the Germans still have today. Prior to that, when they were more like, obviously, when you look at the Holy Roman Empire, it was a bunch of different disparate principalities, and there was a lot more autonomy than what you would obviously be able to see in like a more complicated bureaucracy, such as the actual Roman Empire, which was the political remnants of was controlled by the Palaiologos dynasty at this time. And I think the Westerners, despite obviously claiming that the Holy Roman Emperors, the German emperors, were the rightful Augustus, they still, despite that, obviously understood that reality, at least in theory at this point, the inheritance of Manuel and his title and claim to Roman emperor, despite maybe the theoretical power being more prevalent now than the actual, in the sense that the historic territory of Rome was long a distant memory, and at this point, obviously, it was very little, too little. And Manuel II himself, for all of the pomp and splendor and ceremonies and the reverence that was paid by the Westerners, especially those in England and France, as he visited the different areas and kingdoms that themselves actually had contributed towards the Fourth Crusade, and himself obviously being conscious of that, but was also diplomatic and able to hold himself up with a sense of not having to kind of, bend the knee or bow before the West as like in terms of having humiliated himself as prior and future emperors, in the sense that his sons actually would attempt to, at the cost of having them be complicated figures when it comes to modern views, when it comes to the Orthodox Church. I believe Constantine actually and John had converted to Catholicism, much to the chagrin of the Eastern Orthodox Patriarch in Constantinople at the time, whom obviously the reason being that they converted were to try to get aid from the West. And obviously this was one more concession they made to the Pope, hoping that he was going to be able to muster up another crusade or enough relief to relieve the city as it was being besieged in its final days. But Manuel would not have to sink to such depths, and he actually would gain the respect. And this passage, I think, highlights the interesting interaction between Manuel II and the early French kingdom, which itself, keep in mind, was the successor state to the ancient Franks, whom were one of Rome's biggest rivals and within one of the conquering tribes, which ended up settling in the prior province of Gaul, which is the area in which mostly modern France is located in. So let me read this. So this is from late medieval France, its political elite and juridical discourse. This is a 73rd page, and this is the 6th part. Manuel II Palaiologos at Paris. Another imperial visit, and no Rex Imperator. And Rex Imperator means, obviously, king, and Imperator means emperor in Latin. So that was just like my part. But here, in 1400, another emperor of the Romans came to Paris. This time, it was not the German ruler with his semi-barbaric retinue, but the highly civilized Byzantine emperor, Manuel II Palaeologus. He came to seek help for his hard-driven imperial city that had been under siege by Ottoman troops since in 1394. In 1396, a European crusade army, commanded by the Hungarian king Sigismund and John the Fearless of Burgundy, which intended the relief of Constantinople, had been smashed near Nicopolis on the Danube by Sultan Bayezid I. From this time onwards, only the strength of its fortification saved Constantine's cities from being captured by the infidel. In view of this situation, Emperor Manuel set out on a voyage which led him through Italy, France, and England between 1399 and 1403. He was partly successful in his aim, which was asking for aid, the deliverance of Constantinople, however, which prolonged the existence of the Eastern Empire of the Romans for another 50 years, was not due to Western help, but the result of the catastrophic defeat of the Ottoman army by Timur the Lame's troops in the Battle of Ankara in 1402, which actually had caused the Ottomans to end the siege when Timur and Bayezid had fought, and Timur had captured Bayezid and essentially given the Romans a new lease on life temporarily. That was my little note on that, but let me continue actually. In spite of these somber circumstances, the imperial voyage through France took place in a most triumphant manner. According to Michel Piton, the author of the contemporary Chronique du Religieux de Saint-Denis, and I probably butchered that because I do not speak French. It was a heavenly grace without precedent that the ruler of such a famous empire had came to France. The king, Charles VI, was extremely pleased, and so he ordered the guests to be received in all French towns with imperial honors. The culmination was Manuel's reception before Paris. The king, together with his uncles, his court, and the inhabitants of Paris, awaited him at Charenton-le-Pont, near the royal residences of the Vincennes. There he met with the emperor, who was clad in white garments, and sat on a white horse, which the king himself had sent for his entry. Both rulers greeted one another in the most honorable way, and then the king accompanied the emperor to Paris, where Manuel was to stay at the Louvre Palace, which obviously you can see in modern day. That's just my point. Although Michel Piton's narrative is the only contemporary record of Manuel's reception outside Paris, his is probably authentic as regards the color of his garments and his mount. The fact that the emperor wore white garments is confirmed by Adam of Usk, who mentions the same detail in his descriptions of the imperial voyage to England, as he was a Welsh chronicler. Furthermore, the meeting of the Basileus and the French king at Charenton was used as a motif by the Limburg brothers in their famous Tres Rich Heirs de Duc de Berry. In their illumination for the Epiphany hours, the artists depict the meeting of the three kings or magi. The meeting placed is situated near Paris, and the city is clearly discernible in the background with the silhouette of the Notre Dame and the monastery on Montemar. The dominant architectural element in the center is one of the so-called Montajoy columns, which mark the way from Paris to Saint Denis. The white-clad magus in the foreground, who rides on a white horse, corresponds to contemporary descriptions of Manuel. He wears a crown which resembles both the Western and the Eastern imperial crowns. The magus on the right side represents perhaps the French king, as his banner resembles the oriflamme. Although the evidence for Manuel's reception near Paris still is scant, we may nevertheless presume on the basis of these documents that the Byzantine emperor really entered Paris on a white horse. From the viewpoint of Charles V, such behavior would have been unsupportable in a Roman emperor staying in France. Why then was Emperor Manuel not only allowed but encouraged to do so? What Charles of Luxembourg had peremptorily had been forbidden to do? Was it because Manuel was a powerless, and even exotic emperor, who in ceremonial matters could be treated reverently without any fear of prejudice to French sovereignty? Such an explanation is not tenable for various reasons. On the one hand, it ignores the performative character of political ritual in pre-modern societies. If the emperor's ride on the white horse is a sign of domination, as the continuator of the Grandes Chroniques puts in his description of Emperor Charles' visit to France, then the performances of the ritual directly and immediately produces this domination, even if the performer is a politically weak and militarily powerless emperor, as was in the case of Manuel Palaiologos. If the French king does not acknowledge the overlordship of a strong emperor, he will not acknowledge the overlordship of a weak one either, if only by ritual. On the other hand, ceremonial deference towards a powerless emperor does not explain why the historiographic account of Manuel's reception represents the emperor's ride on the white horse as something appropriate beyond any possible doubt. If by kindness, Palaiologos received the honors which he was not entitled to, the chronicler should have underlined this fact in order to preclude any possible prejudice, all the more so in that the Byzantine emperor, though asking for help, did not do so in such a submissive manner. During his sojourn in Western Europe, he never hid his being a Roman Imperator Augustus, nor did the French observers doubt his imperial claim and its implications. What was different then in 1400? Why did Manuel's reception differ from Charles IV's entry into Paris in 1378, if it was not for the disparity of the respective guests and their imperial status? End quote. And obviously the rest I will provide in the video description to a link which you can read and assess for yourself. But I'd like to now briefly give a little bit of my perspective on this very interesting and I think whimsical quote that I think passage actually that encapsulated the one I quoted a lot of insightful information regarding the circumstances of Manuel's visit. And I will actually have a separate video in which I will talk about his visit to England and the account of Adam of Usk, in which I believe also as well a couple of other YouTubers, including Eastern Roman history and eventually I believe others as well will cover, have done, which I'll include in the video description. This interesting passage was one I think that also deserves to be highlighted and I think is very, very insightful and one of my favorites when it comes to the literature that I've read so far regarding the Byzantine Empire, and obviously one of its more tragic moments. But I think that this one in particular, too, is just as important and has not been highlighted yet. So I think that giving insight on this particular topic and I think providing my own perspective and why the questioning, I think, of the authors of this one actually, as much as they obviously based their assessment of Manuel II's prestige off of the current situation of the empire, which geopolitically had been reduced to being a city-state with some exclaves, obviously, in Greece, but for the most part, it was nowhere near the empire that symbolically Manuel had the prestige of representing and being highlighted for being the leader of. And obviously, that was at the time, as ceremonies were, especially the ones in which others within the ceremony would be paying deference to other people in terms of submission, or humiliating themselves, obviously, before others who claim political prominence. That is something that even to this day, obviously, when it comes to modern presidents and world leaders, is a situation where it's not one that obviously one wants to be in if they have to submit themselves. But if they do, obviously, or they want to if they are humble, obviously. I think most leaders don't want to do this, but I think it is a good trait to be humble. And I think that this decision from the current emperor of France, or king of France, to provide the emperor of Rome, which at this point was mostly known as the Emperor of the Greeks by most of the contemporary scholars and those who looked at Manuel as a petty beggar whom, maybe despite his splendor, was coming to beg on behalf of his empire, which was little more than a city-state. And it was obviously something, especially for one person whom, for his ancestors, would be the successors like to Augustus, such as Constantine, Diocletian, these men who had been able to rule over territories from Scotland, or ancient Caledonia, to modern day Syria and Egypt. But now, obviously, this was a shadow of its former self. But despite that, the political legacy and the continuity of this empire that was clearly still recognizable despite its radical evolution, obviously, and departure, both not just politically, but also from a cultural and linguistic, obviously, the transition between Latin and Greek from being the official and, the official primary languages spoken, as the eastern half of the empire had since the Hellenization, the Hellenistic era, and their annexation eventually into the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire. This, obviously, still, despite the political takeover of Rome, was a prevalent element of the society that would then develop. And there would always be this Latin minority, which would be an elite, usually in the East, that spoke Latin for administrative purposes during the High Empire. But by the time of the late Roman Empire, as it transitioned into what we refer to today as the early Byzantine Empire, at least those within Byzantine studies do. And I'll have a separate video discussing my perspective on the Byzantine-Roman, semantic argument that I always think is interesting, but obviously I think one that misses the forest for the trees and is interesting to have on an esoteric level, but obviously shouldn't be hyper focused on if you want to actually have and learn from this field that I think has a lot of interesting subject matter that I will continue to study up myself. And I recommend those who seem interested, at least if they've listened to this so far, do so themselves. And I'll provide some resources to do so in the video description. But when it comes to the reality being faced at this time, I think it's very interesting how the deference that's being paid, I think, to Manuel, for obviously, despite all of the political evolutions and the nature of this empire that had evolved from at the height of the early Byzantine Empire, and I'd say like late Roman Empire under Justinian I in 565, with the attempted reconquest and restoration of the empire in the west, which had only partially been completed, but still had taken the southeastern part of Spain, the rich coastal area, and that included the capital of this new province of Spania called Cartagena, which I'll talk about in another video soon. But that also included North Africa and Italy, which were both very valuable and strategic provinces, which allowed the Roman Empire to once again resemble a Roman lake under the famous line that the Romans called it, Mare Nostrum, our sea. But that was really temporary, and as soon as Justinian had passed, things went downhill. But there were periods of decline as well as periods of recovery in between. But by the time of Manuel II, that ability to adapt and survive obviously the unlikely odds of whether you're talking the Byzantine Sasanian War of 602 to 628, the Arab conquest, which saw the loss of the provinces just painstakingly regained from the fights with the Persians that only just ended years before. But obviously, with the loss and the weakened state of the empire after those, the Arabs, after they were underestimated, were able to shock the Romans and obviously the Persians as well, which they were able to conquer completely. But the Byzantines, or the Eastern Romans, which were becoming more and more Byzantine, at least in what we understand as the Byzantine name, had lost Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Cilicia, Armenia, all of these provinces that allowed it to be the geopolitical superpower, especially Egypt, which I'll talk about in the video as well. But when it comes to its ability to reform and the development of the theme system under emperors such as Constans II and Constantine V, whom had developed a reform that had radically altered the ability of the nature of the empire and restructured it in a way for it to survive both administratively in a political sense, but also in a military sense. And its foreign policy was able to adapt, and the limited, obvious material resource of the empire were compensated for when it came to a strategically in-depth approach to diplomacy and figuring out ways to maximize the limited resources that they now had to very successful outcomes when it came to dealing with the various neighbors and externalities that had been previously running rampant in the empire. But at one point, obviously in 1025, the predecessors of Manuel Palaiologos, famously Basil II of the Macedonian dynasty, had been able to successfully reconquer most of Eastern Europe up to the Danube and all the way over to the cities of Syria, including Antioch and Laodicea, which today are shared between Turkey and the modern state of Syria, respectively. But despite all of those gains, again, history obviously had its way, and all empires rise and all empires fall. Manuel II, the Palaiologos, was the third to last emperor, and his two sons after him would try just as hard as he did, but would fail in both cases. And I will talk about that in future videos, as I think their failures are lessons to be learned, and I think they're interesting lessons when it comes to their historical context and understanding the final fate of what was left of the Roman Empire in the East. Manuel II had been able to gain the pomp and splendor of being seen by those who, when he toured on Western Europe as a Roman emperor. But in reality, obviously, the Ottomans were continuing to press on him, and he would not really get the level of material and military aid that he had came to request. He got a lot of warm gifts and rhetoric, but obviously the promises for aid in the future did not really materialize enough to make a difference in the grand scheme of things. And Manuel II would end up obviously passing in the 1420s, and the rest obviously is history. I actually made a video on the fall of Constantinople, and that will be somewhere in this video, included in the description, and also in the, are they called annotations? Maybe cards? I mean, who knows at this point, but you know what I'm talking about. I hope you enjoyed this particular podcast where I discussed a passage that I believe deserves more attention, and I definitely recommend afterwards, if you did not catch the 100% that the aims that I tried to talk about here when it comes to getting to a feel for what was going on and really contextualizing it, as maybe my monotone voice might not always be able to project that level of passion and interest that might really need to be emphasized. But I think there's a lot of, at the end of the day, benefit to be had for reading and learning from this period. And I think the imperial humility of a man who would be, maybe if in a different time, the ruler of the world, as the Romans of old had claimed, I think it's very much humiliating, but I think also a lesson in learning from, in the sense that he actually was willing to, contrary to the past emperors of Rome, which in the late days of the empire had palace princes who you would have to go to them, not the other way around. They would not be touring or risking their livelihoods. At that point, though, the walls had already caved in, and the riches of Egypt and Syria by the 1400s were distant memories, and many of the ancient monuments that had been constructed from the days of Constantine the First and onwards had decayed, and some had completely collapsed. And I think that the glories of old, and I think that just because obviously, at some point in your life you might be, analogous to the empire, if you think about people. I mean, just because at some point you might be at the top of your game doesn't necessarily mean that that's always going to be the case. And sometimes it might seem impossible, as much as the Romans probably thought so when they still had possession of Egypt and Syria and all these other provinces, that there would ever be a day in which their successors would have to be in such a desperate strait and would be put in a situation where they would have to humble themselves so much to the same kingdoms that had actually been the successor states to the tribes that had carved out and created their own independent statelets from the western provinces of the Roman Empire, in particular, in this case, Gaul, which we were talking about, which became, after an evolution of centuries of development, including the Franks, and then obviously under Charlemagne, the different sons of Charlemagne, and then their successors, whom had obviously had their own interesting histories, which I should definitely talk about in future content. But that would become the early medieval kingdom of France, which would be the predecessor to our the modern day France, which itself deserves to have its own conversation. But hopefully this video itself and podcast had highlighted an interesting part of history, and you appreciated, and it was something that was worth your time. I appreciate you guys for tuning in, and let me know what you think. And if you have any thoughts and any of that stuff, let me know either here or over on Twitter. My Twitter is @TJC, and the show's is on @GetNuanced. Thank you for watching, and make sure to subscribe and click the bell notification if you enjoy this type of content. And tune in for more as I produce it in the future. Thanks again, and I'll catch you all in the next one I make real soon. Peace out.